Now we'll move on to our welcome our second keynote speaker of the day, Paul Wagner. Paul is the Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for strategy, planning, and transformation enablement within the Office of the Chief Information Officer of Canada branch of Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. It's quite a mouthful. What that really means is that he's responsible for leading a number of key strategic files that are focused on supporting the Government of Canada's digital journey. Previously, Paul was the Interim Chief Technology Officer for the Government of Canada, where he led an evolutionary leap into new digital landscapes by working in collaboration with experts, business and digital leaders to harness innovative management approaches and integrate trusted and emerging technology into solutions. He's also served as CIO for Justice Canada, Library and Archives Canada, and the National Research Council. Paul brings over 3 decades of private and public sector experience in information and digital technologies to the executive table. Paul Wagner, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, great for being here. And we'll have to do something with that bio. It's far too long and maybe too overly ambitious in terms of what was achieved and what we're getting done. But hey, listen, that's the topic of discussion today. So what I propose, folks, is we spend the next 30 or 40, probably 30 minutes walking through a bit of lessons learned on the Government of Canada digital agenda and digital journey, and what that means as we move forward and how we're actually pivoting to do things a little bit differently. And I really want to leave a lot of time for questions. I think in the last session there was a lot of great questions there, and I think that's one of the big values out of these sessions. So really honored to be here today. Really want to thank the organizers for inviting me. And yeah, so if you think about strategy for government in the digital age, and you'll see, I'm going to rip off a couple of things that Liam was talking about, but it's really about how we deliver government services in a modern era in our current landscape. And certainly the last 2 years have done a lot to amplify the expectations, I think, of Canadians and Canadian businesses and people coming to Canada. And we've had a chance to deliver on some of those areas, but it'd be remiss to say that we're not sitting down and looking and saying, well, we got it all right, so now we just need to keep going. I think we did a lot of learning, and we delivered some programs and some services in a way that was absolutely it demonstrated the value of digital. But there's an awful lot of work yet left to do, and we'll cover some of these points in the deck here and in the questions that follow. So if you look here, the idea is around charting a course to a happier, healthier, more resilient, sustainable Canada. One of the big things around thinking about where we go next and what our next foot forward is from a digital perspective is it's not about the technology. I think Liam, great point at the end. When we talk about cloud first, it doesn't mean cloud for everything. And cloud is an operating model, not a technology. It's a way to think about how you deliver services in a way that is composable and actually can shift with your business model. But it doesn't mean that everything has to go in the cloud. And certainly from a government perspective, there are some things that it doesn't make sense to put it into a cloud for a variety of reasons, security in some cases being one of those. And so that's kind of the underpinning for our strategy. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We're looking for, as I mentioned, this is about digital government, not about a technology plan, or we used to have IT plans in the government and so forth. But we're really, pivoting to service in this one. And this quote from our Governor General, the decade is still young. With compassion, courage, and determination, we'll have the power to make it better than how it started. And that can only happen by standing together. And never before, and this is sort of the call to public servants, never before has so much depended on our ability to deliver results for Canadians. And I think that we're taking that to heart as we think about what an ambition would look like from a digital government perspective. Next slide, please. So in thinking about doing government in a digital age, we started to think about what are the conditions for success and what are the expectations that citizens have. And it's really around creating the conditions for trust for our citizens. So, even just seeing this, this is probably 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we would never see a digital ambition, digital strategy, digital plan, starting with something as profound as that, but thinking about designing systems, designing services that serve Canadians, that serve Canadian businesses and people that are coming to Canada. It's about trust, and that trust is the foundation for our democracy and our economy, and it's really how Canada has grown through the decades. And so the goal here is that we think about implementing technology, implementing programs that don't divide us, but actually bring us together. And so thinking of, Liam was talking about some of the barriers around data and things like that. I mean, this is sort of at the 30,000 foot level, but if you roll it back and think about, if we're talking about creating trust for citizens, so we're talking about creating a foundation for democracy, what are some of the enabling activities that we need to look at as a government to think about accessibility, to think about data portability, to think about privacy and security in the delivery of services? I've given tech briefings to a number of MPs around digital ID as an example, and we can talk about that. That's one where that whole concept of trust, privacy, and security really kind of converge when we talk about an individual's digital credentials and what that can unlock for them from a service perspective. And so in the next few slides, this one included, you're going to see some quotes there on the right, and I'm not going to read them for you. I know you can read them as I'm talking to you, but there's some really cool quotes that we got from people that are outside of our sphere, provincial CIOs, and some experts in some area. The one from Luigi, thinking about government has a unique opportunity to engender trust in people, and I think that's our role, and it comes out a lot when we think about digital ID, in that as we work with provinces and territories and build out a pan-Canadian ecosystem for digital ID that was going to be, the banks are there now. Some governments are there. BC and Alberta have digital ID platforms and ecosystems in place. But imagine a Canada that has all of Canada digital ID ecosystem, that a small and medium enterprise that's starting up, 3, 5, 10 person organization can become a verifier of digital IDs, and all of a sudden create a digital platform that they can, ensure the trust and the authenticity of the people that they're transacting with. Incredibly powerful. And so, you go across all the different domains and you start to unlock some of those areas. But it really starts with thinking about the problem and the service from a citizen perspective. Next slide, please. I would say in the past, in terms of lessons learned, as you go into the next slide, the lesson learned there is really around a lot of, in the past, we focused an awful lot on technology. And, as Phil was saying at the beginning, I was CIO for Department of Justice and NRC and Library and Archives Canada. And largely, until recently, the CIOs had to be CTOs in the departments. They were primarily focused on making sure the systems were running. And I would say, as much as we talk about Shared Services Canada and the challenges at the time the creation of Shared Services Canada had, what it did do is it freed up the CIOs to actually focus on service, to focus on data, because the technology element, the technology stack, was being taken care of by Shared Services Canada. And so it was a really, I think it's actually helped propel some of the CIOs in the government space to look at problems differently, to actually be at the strategic table, as we talked about for a long time, because you didn't come in and have to worry about the technology. Of course, you're still accountable and make sure that the systems are running, but you had an organization that is built to make sure that that's happening. So I think that's a really unique proposition and a value proposition that we have within the federal government, and one that CIOs really need to take advantage, and digital leaders need to take advantage of, in that it helps you start to have the conversations around the service side as opposed to the technology side. This slide here, really kind of cool. We started thinking about, again, services, thinking about the different platforms and what we have. Today, one of the challenges that we have, I mean, we live in a Westminster system, which means a lot of vertical accountabilities. So every department thinking about the programs and services that they have to deliver. And I think, as we move forward, and from a digital perspective, not that I think that digital is going to end up, changing the Westminster system, but I do think we have opportunities to change the mechanisms that we have underneath the Westminster system in terms of developing out some horizontal accountability to think about human services. And so if you think about that, instead of technology services, which, in the past, every department had their own data centers, Shared Services Canada is starting to fix that. Cloud certainly allows us to move and become much more horizontal. But if you think about human services, and technology is amplifying those human services, but in the end, it's humans providing services to humans. And so I think it really shifts the focus from being about a technology service or a digital service to actually being human service. And what is the human looking for on the other side of the service? What is the citizen looking for? What's the business looking for? And so we're not only thinking about the technology ecosystem, but the human ecosystem and how the services affect change in communities. And when you think about those human services, you necessarily start to bundle some of the programs that we have in government together. And I think, the idea of the quote from a GC leader here, being in the business of human services requires thinking about how and where and when to interact with the government. And so that's always from the citizen lens. And I mean, that's, one of our digital standards speaks to designing with users. And this amplifies that in a really big way. And it becomes less about the technology. I mean, the reality, I think, everybody on this call will say the technology is the easy part. AWS is an example. All kinds of great technology that they can provide us to solve the problems. But we really do need to think about what is the problem we're trying to solve, and are there linkages to other problems or other services that only make sense to connect together, regardless if it's another department, regardless if it's another mandate. That's the sort of leadership and the courage that we need to have as public servants, to stand up and to start to tie those services together for the benefit of humans, the benefit of our citizens. So really, a bit of a mind shift. As I said at the beginning, this is a little bit different than you've seen in the past, where we'll talk about some technical debt, and I'll get to that for sure. But this is really at the basis of how we're starting to think about how we design services. Next slide, please. This is a really cool one. And if you look, I'll start with a quote from Chris Hadfield at the bottom. Almost everybody up until now has only known the little tiny bits of where our feet have touched the earth. And coming from Chris Hadfield, that's a pretty powerful statement. We need to start seeing the world globally and behaving globally. And I think, when you think about global solutions, or if you even go a little bit, further afield than just the federal government, national solutions, we can really leverage our reputation from a trust perspective. I mean, again, I think everybody here, if you walk around with a Canadian passport and you travel with a Canadian passport, there's a level of trust, a level of expectation around what that means. Do we simply want to keep up with the pace of change, which I'll show you in a little bit, where we've fallen way behind? Or as those unafraid of challenges as we are in Canada? I mean, hey, we have winters. We start to think about, when we talked about this slide and what it meant, what do we have that makes us truly Canadian? Winters, weather events like we've never seen. If you're in Ottawa, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And as public servants, our role is to be flexible and have that, muscle of agility and being iterative. And I think, we have an opportunity to take our place back as a leader in terms of doing government in digital age. We used to be, way back when, we were at the top of the heap. Now, granted, the denominator, the number of, of countries and organizations that are working at doing government in a digital age has gone up, and so the denominator goes up. It has an effect here, but I think we can do better, and I think we need to think about how, as a North Star, if we want to be that sort of top of the heap again, where people look to Canada in terms of how we're delivering services digitally, that gives you the license to have the courage and gumption to actually change and challenge the status quo. There's an awful lot of underlying, and you'll see in one of the priorities here in a few slides, there's an awful lot of structural barriers that are in the way. And I know there's a lot of people in the audience today that are interested in seeing some of that changed to be able to actually do their jobs. And I think we need to have that courage and that openness. And digital does that. It allows you to have a dialogue around. I usually refer to digital as a bit of a Trojan horse, where you can start talking about technology, you can talk about policies and process, you can talk about the legislation that's in place, and challenge all those things. Challenge some of the service, opportunities. Challenge some of the service expectations that are out there, and all under the guise of digital. And I think it's a really cool way that we have in Canada aligned service delivery and digital. And if you just look in the federal government, we've got a policy on service and digital. Those aren't two separate things, because we recognize that doing digital is about delivering services. And I was on a talk a little while back with someone from the US and talking about their executive order around digital services. And in the pre-briefs and so forth, they were envious of the policies that we have, because they have a executive order, but we've ensconced it in our policy, and we continue to evolve those policies as we learn more about doing government in a digital age. Next slide, please. So we know how to do this. As I mentioned before, we used to be top of the heap. And as Canadians, I think we know how to, how to work hard and actually create a difference. And I think if we do think about this in the sense of a much broader experience than simply what are the government services that we're offering, and how do we take what we're doing today in a PDF and make it a digital platform, or worse, a paper process, and turn it into a digital platform. But if we actually think further, we're going to have to look at the talent we've got, continue to expand our talent pool, which is really difficult in today's world, right? I mean, I think again, everybody around this call recognizes that the talent pool that we're all pulling from, whether that's private sector or public sector, is very, very tight. And we've got about a 30% vacancy rate in the IT world within Government of Canada. And that's 30% based on operations. So that's not even thinking about how do we evolve and move some of these things forward. So we're going to have to think about doing these things differently, and I'll talk about some of the ways that we're looking at. And as I mentioned before, it's going to take leaders, it's going to take all of you on this talk who can look beyond today's challenges and think about, okay, so what does the future actually look like? And I think that the time is now for us to do that. We're coming somewhat out of a period where we demonstrated the value of digital. The opportunity to snap back is, although we talk about it, it's not there. And I think there's an awful lot of time that we're spending as executives to make sure that we don't snap back, because it'd be way too easy, and it would be shame on us if we did, to actually snap back to analog ways. And I think so. We have a burning platform right now to actually be able to accelerate some of these things. And I would say, without speaking for ministers, which I would never propose to do, our minister, Minister Fortier, who is also the minister responsible for digital government, is hugely engaged in this file, along with a lot of her colleagues, around how do we accelerate the pace of adopting digital government? What things, what do we prioritize, which necessarily means what do we stop doing so that we can actually focus time and resources and energy on moving forward from a digital government perspective. Next slide, please. So, an ambition to enable a government in the digital age for all Canadians and businesses that are it's accessible, and that allows us to express the best of Canada in the digital space. And I think it's it's bigger than it's bigger than digital. It's about transforming and enabling the way that we do government, and that's a big ask. And I think it's going to come down to prioritization, because we can't do it all. Rolling 100 snowballs forward is interesting, but rolling a big one forward and actually achieving it and getting over the goal line, that's something that makes an awful lot of sense. And I think it's something that we haven't been good at in terms of prioritization. We come up with a list of priorities, but we don't draw a line and say everything here needs to wait while we actually succeed in some of these places. And I think as we start to think about being more of an enterprise, so digital ID is a great example. Instead of having multiple departments figure out how to do a verification platform, how do we do that once for government and then everybody plugs into that? So those types of models around thinking much more about enterprise is absolutely critical for us to be able to move forward in a digital age. Next slide, please. I think there's only a couple of slides left that we can get to get some questions here. So if you think about that ambition that I was talking about in terms of creating a government in a digital age, first one is actually, interestingly, as I said, it wasn't about a technology play, it's not about a technology plan, but you do need to be excellent in technology and operations. So that's something that has to run as we put systems into place, service standards, service expectations, citizens standards, and citizens expectations more specifically. We have to be able to measure those, and we have to be excellent in those spaces. Data-enabled digital services and programs. So I think you're seeing a much stronger push around data. We've actually have a chief data officer for the federal government now, Stephen Burt. And so from an OCIO perspective, or an Office of the Chief Information Officer, we're putting an incredible amount of focus on data. And this to me is a little bit back to what I was talking about around CIOs not being CTOs anymore, but actually moving into different domains and having dialogues about service, dialogues about data. And as we think about what even Liam was saying around some of the silos that we've created from a data perspective, we need to start thinking about how we can leverage data to across portfolios and across programs. So really strong focus on that now. Action ready digital strategy and policy. A little bit what I'm talking about here. There's we're working through a lot of details behind what I'm showing you here today at a high level, but the policy piece is a really important one. So how do we define policies and establish performance against those policies and iterate them through? So we recently updated a standard that we had that was previously updated and created in 2012, and it stood that whole time without any changes. I think you can all agree since 2012 to 2022, we've had enormous amounts of changes in this. This was in the ERP space. And so, a lot of change happened in the ERP space, but this policy, stagnated from my perspective, and it ended up getting refreshed. And, we wanted to use that as a model of saying, look, we can spend a year and consult and do all kinds of, information sharing with the policy as we move it forward, or we can get it 80% right, put it out there and test it out, as opposed to doing something that's more academic and thinking about what about this, what about that. So again, following a bit of the digital principles of being iterative, get it out there, test it out, see if it works, see if it doesn't work, and then adjust as required. And then, the last piece I was talking about before, in terms of, there needs to be a bit of an evolution in the way that we fund, we hire and retain talent, and the kind of culture, again, to one of Liam's points. Like if you think about just even that first one around funding, the government of Canada is, used to funding projects. And so in the past, you'd have a project that would set up a program, you'd have money to buy servers or set up a data center, and then the money would kind of go away because you'd be finished the project. But there'd be ongoing costs with that and evergreening costs of infrastructure, which has led us to an incredible amount of technical debt that we have in the system and ecosystem today. So, as we think about cloud, just a simple example, but if a program running on cloud is wildly successful, the usage of the cloud will go up, therefore cost will go up. That's not a model that our financial structure within government today is set for. It's, the appropriations are quite different. And I just, I don't see a model where a department gets an appropriation of money and they're using, let's say, 100% cloud, and all of a sudden, they max out and the programs are so successful, but they say, well, no, we've hit our financial cap, so we're going to stop delivering the service. That's clearly not going to happen. But I think we need to get ahead of that in terms of how we think about how funding is allocated to departments and how we start to think about sustainability of funding for both on-premise and in the cloud. talent, mentioned before, I think there's some really innovative ways that we can approach some of the talent issues. Some of the areas I know Catherine Lilo, our CIO, has been talking as one example in the fintech area, where she's working with FinTrack and a few other organizations to see, are there opportunities for IT professionals in the fintech space within Canada to actually work on some government programs for a period of time, come in, bring their experience. We benefit obviously as a government, they benefit as a sector, and they end up going back into their sector. So I think we have to think about the talent pool that we have as a country and how we best serve the country together in delivering those services. Next slide, please. I think it's my last one. It is. So, just in terms of overall timelines here, and once we actually launch a digital ambition, the idea being investing in the core. And it was interesting. Someone challenged me on this in a previous talk. They said, "Well, deliver and build trust by changing." And you do that in 6 to 12 months. Absolutely not. We're not going to change the mentality or change the culture in 6 to 12 months. But we start to talk about things in a very different way, as you've heard in the last few slides, and the way I'm even talking about digital. We've learned. I think the idea of big bang is long gone. The concept of being iterative as we move through programs and service delivery is where we're at now. And I think as requests come through the system within the federal system, Treasury board submissions and so forth, we're starting to see that more iterative approach, milestones, as opposed to give us the money for 3 years, and in 3 years you're going to have this great thing. The problem is in 3 years, maybe a government changes, maybe legislation changes, and technology is definitely going to evolve. So, really critical sort of elements to think about how we do this iteratively, and that's about proving the value of digital. And thinking about those digital standards that we have and how we sort of live by that, and really make some hard decisions based on that. I think we need to get to a point, and I think Catherine spoke about this recently in an interview. We have the GC Enterprise Architecture Review Board that I co-chair with Matt Davies from Shared Services Canada. But how do we get to the point where we do have a digital ID as an enterprise system, and that's the only system that you can use, unless there's some wildly wild reason why that wouldn't work for a program. But the idea that we reduce the number of unicorns that we have and snowflakes, because everybody's coming forward with their own individual systems to deliver. We need to be able to get to enterprise systems, and that does require us to prioritize and say no to some things. And I think we need to have the courage to be able to start doing that. And then scaling the impact, as we said, those enterprise possibilities, looking at commitments and partnerships with other sectors. And then, ultimately, down the road, we start to make sure that we have a system in place that allows us to, government in a digital age is not a flag on a hill. It's a culture. And so that culture needs to be able to continue to evolve and to improve over time. And so to me, that would kind of be the goal here in terms of a digital ambition. And I think that's my last slide, Phil, and we can maybe open it up for questions with that.
Absolutely. Paul, thanks for a great session. There's some big challenges and opportunities ahead. From the school's perspective, it's been great working with your office on helping the federal public service grow in the realm of digital transformation. And I particularly appreciate your comments about the changing nature of the CIO from Chief Technology Officer to maybe more commonly now the Chief Transformation Officer, whether they have that title or not. Right. I think the C-suite of any department has to make room for transformation, and the CIO or CTO or even the CDO is in many ways providing direction to the entire organization, not just to the IT people, which is a job that was traditionally the exclusive purview of the CEO or the COO, right?
Yeah,
so
100%. I think, what's interesting is, not that we need, I was going to say, not that we need another C-suite executive, but if you think about like a chief service officer. So if you go back to the fact that we've got digital and service together, we're calling them chief digital officers. But, for me, the value of a chief information officer, digital officer, is they need to be absolutely conversant in the services of the organization that they work in. And that, that's the real, in the past, it used to be, like I said, about being a CTO, if you knew how to run networks and data centers, and you knew how to make sure people's, Blackberries back then worked and laptops worked, you were a great CIO. Like you were the guy or the gal that everybody wanted because you knew how to, you knew how to take care of the plumbing. And I mean, I remember, many sessions where they always referred to CIOs as plumbers. And that was a bit, well, we're a little more than that. But I think, it is really an evolution. I think it's predicated on knowing the services that your business offers or your organization delivers, as well as any of the service or business line leads.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the questions here. Actually, this one's not a question, but someone wrote, I love this. Magic happens when technology amplifies human potential. So I thought that was a great comment. I thought I'd put it out there. Here's a question. What type of governance changes are you seeing that can help enable success of large transformation? I know you talked about policy, but maybe some quick insight on governance overall.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and one near and dear to my heart, because I'm actually still wearing two hats. So I'm still the Chief Technology Officer of the federal government for the next 6 days or 8 days. Shirley Ivan, who's currently the CIO at the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, will be joining our team on June 6th, and will be taking over the reins as the Chief Technology Officer. And then my role around strategy and transformation is really, in line with that question. And I think, some of what we're seeing works, and I'll talk a little bit about what happened in COVID, but also what we're seeing in some of the large transformations in government. So in COVID, when it hit, everybody had to go and work from home, and then we had to think about how we do this, delivering services remotely, delivering services digitally, because nobody was going to, Service Canada sites and so forth, or very few people were. The governance that worked was often, rapid, and with key decision makers. So there wasn't, like in government, we love having, well, if you have a DM committee, you absolutely have to have an ADM committee supporting that DM committee. You probably need a DG committee supporting the ADM committee. Like we drown ourselves in governance. When it came to making decisions for how do we roll out 300,000 people to work from home, how do we engage the vendor community to help support network service provisioning, how do we set up CERB? Prime Minister gets up on a Monday and says, in 2 weeks you'll be able to apply for CERB. We had clarity of focus, and we had the allocation of resources to those areas of focus. And the key leaders, so the CTO for the Government of Canada, the head of the of CCCS, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, the executive VP over at Shared Services Canada, they got together daily to make decisions. And that kind of iterative governance, as well documented, it made all the difference. And so, not that I'm suggesting that we need to do that on transformation projects, but what we are seeing on some of the key transformation projects that we have in government, so the benefits delivery modernization over at ESDC, or the digital platform modernization at IRCC, is we call it nimble assurance and sort of iterative governance. And you don't have these massive governance tables anymore that have all subsections. You get the key decision makers together, and you make sure that you're not pushing every decision up to them, which we often do. Again, we kind of push a lot of decisions up, empowering the teams to make the decisions they need to, have them understand the guardrails that they need to play in. But if those are the experts and those are the people that are accountable at the director, DG, let them be accountable. But create an environment where if they're going to make decisions that are going to, that something's going to fail, learn and move on. And if you're doing that quickly, you can do that without a lot of negative impact, maybe a lot of positive impact. But if your governance committees are once every quarter and something falls apart, well, you're 3 months out. So having that, that sort of rapid and iterative governance, I think is really what we're seeing, and we're testing out some different models with different programs to see what actually works.
Great, thanks. Another question: how do we balance digital everything and service for all Canadians, including people who can't navigate the simplest of self-serve windows? So yeah, how do we keep serving those Canadians and let's say the public service workforce as well, for those who may not be inclined to or not able to use the digital technologies?
Yeah, no, so, couple of angles there. I mean, accessibility absolutely by design. It's not, well, okay, we'll build it and then we'll make it accessible. Accessibility from the beginning, otherwise it's a non-starter. And I've had some great conversations with Yasmin LaRoche and Alfred from OPSA, which is the Office of the Public Service Accessibility. And, that it's one of those areas where I think, as I was mentioning in terms of the timeline, we need to have the intestinal fortitude, the courage to say, yeah, if it's not accessible by design, it's not happening, period. And so I think, those are kind of things that we need to think about as we start to evolve and develop services. No Canadian left behind, absolutely. I mean, as you evolve digital services and you think about, digital ID and ultimately eventually having a portal where you can access government services, 100%. But we still need to have the in-person service for people that are going to be going in person. There, many communities you're not going to get digitally literate people and people that have the tools and technology to be able to access that. So, is it places where they can go in and somebody, as a proxy can actually work through those digital services? I think that to me is how it will benefit people who actually don't use digital. Is as we evolve these services, those that are providing service in an in-person, human services in an in-person way are going to be able to leverage technology that is going to still help the person standing in front of them. It's just being done through an agent or through a proxy in that point. But I think the work that we have to do to think about how we digitalize services and how we create services that are meaningful to Canadians is going to benefit all Canadians, regardless of whether you're using an iPhone or not.
Boy, the questions are coming in at a feverish pace. I like it. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get through all of them, but we still have some while to go. So let's move ahead on some questions here. I think here's a good key question for executives. How do you avoid falling back into the old habits instead of transforming forward?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's, and we're starting to have a lot of these discussions as obviously, we're looking at return to the workplace or really, truly implementing, actually, let me strike that, not return to the workplace, truly implementing hybrid. I think we've all, I haven't signed a piece of paper in 28 months it is. Even my letter of offer for that ADM job, I was waiting to sign it with, I'm a bit old school. I still use a fountain pen. I'm a tech guy by day, but a fountain pen user by night. And I was looking forward to signing my letter of offer, as we all do. And it was digital, right? So I go and I get my PKI key and I sign it, and oh, there we go, that's done. But I do think, thinking about we've gotten by, and every department has done a lot of different things to kind of get by. Now's our opportunity. Like I said, we're kind of on this precipice of saying, so how do we actually create sustained change in this? And I think that's every leader's challenge in this, is to say, no, we're not going to go back and we're not going to start passing around, dockets that go from desk to desk. We're not going to go back to thinking about delivering services in a vertical way. And we've got to put in, about a little bit to the other question around governance. We've got to put in the right governance with the right challenge. We have to have the professional humility to make sure that the people that are around the table that are helping to make decisions, and decisions are taken by individuals, not committees. But if I'm the chair of a governance table, I want to have a lot of diverse voices at that table that are going to make sure that when I do make a decision, and I'm going to be held accountable for that decision, I've got all the voices about why this will work, why this won't work, how this is going to affect productivity, how this is going to affect privacy. You have to think about all that. And I think, we need to broaden our governance when we think about some of these things as we move forward, as we continue to transform, and kind of break down the silos between our organizations.
Excellent. Let's see. Well, here's a fresh question. Actually, I like this one because it's about the North, and I like the North. So the internet is incredibly expensive in the North, Nunavut, for example. How can the government of Canada treat all citizens fairly if access is compromised or maybe not available or not as easily available?
So it's a great question, right? And we talk about, I talk an awful lot about, Canada and Canadians and not thinking about just from a government of Canada or federal perspective. There's I know some projects that are being funded through ISED and a number of other departments. I think Shared Services Canada is involved as well to improve connectivity, and that was certainly, this government's one of their mandates is to improve connectivity coast to coast to coast. So, while not necessarily in the federal government's remit to provide that connectivity, it is important that as we think about digital service delivery, exactly as one of the questions was, what about people that can't access, the technology? Those are some of the questions that we need to look at in terms of access. So I'd say that, there's two parts to that answer. One is, getting connectivity to Canadians, and there are some projects underway. And I think if you think about some of the technology we have around, low Earth orbit technologies now and 5G, coming down the pipe, we're going to see an ever increasing sprawl of connectivity. But that doesn't mean that we can simply say, oh, hang on, if I look at a map of Canada and if a city is covered in a green, then they've got connectivity, so I'm not going to worry about that. We do need to think about how we deliver services to citizens digitally that may not have the same kind of bandwidth that we do sitting in, downtown Ottawa or downtown Toronto.
Yeah, absolutely. A question on gaps. What are the top one or two things that we need to do for the federal public service to be a leader in government? In other words, what are the key gaps that we need to close and surpass?
Any easier questions, Phil, that you got?
I have a large volume of questions, but I don't know if they're any easier.
What are the key gaps? I think I would say courage would be one of those areas. The courage to challenge the status quo, and the courage to. I was reading a Twitter post before, and we often talk about the public servant's sort of credo being providing fearless advice and loyal implementation. And I think we loyally implement, and I think we do that well. I think we implement too many things. Let me be and we don't know how to unimplement things. We don't know how to turn things off. We've got technical debt that is surmountable, but not in this, in this current government for sure. It's extremely daunting as we look at how we can move forward from with a service modernization agenda, but you're still taking all this technical debt with us. I mean, the joke that's out there is our old age security service and application, the code is actually old enough to apply for old age security. Not the platforms. We've renewed the platforms, but the actual application code is old enough to apply for old age security. That's not prime time, right? So we're working at modernizing that, and so there's a technical debt aspect to that, and there's a service modernization. But I do think, so back to the question, courage, I think is one of those areas. From being able to stand up and challenge the status quo, being able to push something forward all the way up through to the minister's level, to evoke change and to evoke sustainable change. Like we've seen a lot of flash in the pan kind of interesting things that get invested in and tried out. And if they fail, that's fine, as long as you learn from it and continue to evolve. But a lot of things, there's a lot of bodies along the road here that, we've tried stuff and we stop, or we continue to keep it on life support. I think we need to have the courage to say, we're not going to do that anymore. And we're actually going to focus resources and effort in over here. The other place, and this is one I personally believe, and I think it kind of leads to a little bit what we were talking about before around the Westminster system and thinking about how we deliver services, is a bit of professional humility in terms of saying, how could we deliver this, and who do I need around the table, because I don't have all the answers and my team doesn't have all the answers. So who do we need to bring in around the table? And that could be other service partners, it could be private sector, It could be other governments. I just think it's really important to have that humility to think about how do you make the problem whole by ensuring that you have the right lenses around the table.
Yep. Excellent, thank you. So here's one maybe a little bit up your alley here. Enterprise business architecture helps us understand our parts and their relationships. How are we building architecture capacity for the whole of government?
Ask Shirley Ivan in 8 days. It's a great question, and it is one. So whoever asked that question is right on, poking at a bit of a space where we need to do better. So maybe another gap. As we start to think about systems from an enterprise perspective, we do need to start to create an enterprise architecture. Because right now we've got some standards, we've got expectations about around cloud first, cloud smart, but we need to think about, and this is back to professional humility. We need to have a service lens on that enterprise architecture that says, if we're going to deliver services in this way, what is the technology architecture that we actually need to enable that service delivery? And I think that's a place that we haven't been as vocal and as strong as we need to be. And here's one of the areas where, if you look across the spectrum of the federal government, and we want to put, we want to create a digital ID platform, or we want to create the enterprise architecture, for the next 12 to 24 months, not all the right people that we need to do that are, let's say, within Treasury Board Secretariat. There are a ton of smart people in other departments that we need to pull together and work on, a project or a program, or in this case, an architecture. I think that's how we're going to get to ground on this, because again, then that's breaking down the silos. One of the digital ID, I'll use that one as the example, because as we start to think about how we build that out, if I look at the team that we have within the Treasury Board Secretariat, it's tiny. They could fit in this office. But if you think about CRA, ESDC, IRCC, maybe CBSA, who would benefit from a common digital ID platform, well, instead of them working on individual tools to kind of get by, let's bring them all together and deliver a digital ID platform, probably faster, probably better, and very well suited to those departments. It's not a muscle that we're used to doing. And I think from an enterprise architecture perspective as well, we got to bring service leaders from those departments and some of the technology leaders to establish that, as opposed to thinking about, they used to talk about, probably still do, talk about TBS being the ivory tower. That doesn't work. It's got to be the tent on the ground with all the troops, to use a military analogy. It can't be in the ivory tower. It's got to have people from every platoon in this. I won't take it any further than that. Working on the solutions, and I think that's something that we would like to do. I think there's pockets of it that happen within government, but I think we need to find a way to systematize where we say, this is a priority. Phil, you're a leader in that space. You need to come and work on this for the next 6 to 9 months and help us get it over the goal line.
Absolutely. But here's we've got 4 or 5 minutes to go. So here's maybe a palate cleanser comment here. Someone wrote about your presentation, Paul. This presentation is incredible. Love the anchor on trust in government. And I think, your references to trust in government, I think is key to engagement from not only people who live in Canada, but also, our colleagues in the various levels of public service.
I'm happy to get questions. I'm even happier to get compliments. So keep it coming.
Maybe this is someone who works in your shop. Maybe you put a plan.
As long as we'll keep everything anonymous. It's PMA time in the government, eh? So you got to be
let's see here. Here's something that is near and dear to my heart. Digital transformation must be coupled with digital literacy for Canadians and employees in the public service. How are we doing in this area?
That's an awesome question. So I did give it, like I said, I gave some technical briefings recently on digital ID to members of Parliament, and that exact topic came up where we were talking about sort of digital ID. We were talking about disinformation, misinformation about digital ID. Is it a massive database? Is it Big Brother watching? You know, and it really brought to light, and the comments from some of the MPs was around, you know, raising the level of digital literacy writ large in the country. And so, you know, we're going to think about doing that, you know, and I keep harping on digital ID, and my apologies, there's many examples. It's just one that's very topical for me these days. But, you know, we're going to put out some information on the TBS website about what a digital ID is, what are digital credentials, what is it not. And I think it's important for us to get out as a government, and you know, I'll depoliticize this, but as a bureaucracy, and put those educational pieces out there. I think the Canada School of Public Service has got some great tools that we use inside that, you know, if you take out some of the lingo, the government lingo, could probably be great products that would, you know, serve Canadians well, where somebody could watch a video, and I know we've done this in many cases, you know, watch the 30-second or minute-and-a-half video on digital ID, watch the minute-and-a-half video on accessing your taxes online and so forth, and just, you know, start to really dispel some of the myths out there and some of the disinformation that exists. I think that's going to be absolutely critical, because that's what's going to help elevate and or in some cases maintain the level of trust that Canadians have in the way that we provide services. They have that trust when they come in and they see a human on the other side of the shield now, or the other side of the plexiglass now. And we need to think about how do we, you know, create that digital literacy, certainly, you know, in all ages, but a lot in some of the younger ages. And that was some of the, you know, the interesting information that we were getting in these sessions with the MPs. And we're actually going to be going out on the digital ID front and doing public consultations to see, so what do people think about that? What do they, what is the connotation that they get when they hear about digital ID? What is their level of understanding? And I think through those kind of public consultations, which we need to do more of, we talk about open government. So I think we need to be open in that space and find out what is concerning for Canadians, and then put out products that help to inform and as I said, dispel some of the disinformation out there.
Okay, thanks, Paul. You know what? One more question. Let's do one more question here. This one's a little bit more in the IT realm, but from an IT team's perspective, how do we balance being digital evangelists with the realistic workload expectations or the capacity issues that this causes?
You know, I think a little bit of leadership from every seat, and this is culture change across government for sure. But I do think, you know, we've all become, you know, stuck in front of a screen, and you know, certainly over the last 2 years. And you know, I think probably all of us have, you know, the sandwich schedule, you know, of meetings that start at 8, end at 6, and it's just, you know, one after the other, because you don't have to get up and walk to another building. You don't have to, you know. And so I do think we need to, you know, create boundaries and say, yeah, I'm taking lunch from here to here. Consider me in a meeting. Like if I was in a meeting, unless it's, you know, the minister, whatever, you know, you've got to create those spaces for yourself. That's just obviously from a personal scheduling perspective. But I do think, you know, as we were talking about before, in terms of doing things differently, doing things digitally, you do need to stand up and challenge and say, why are we doing this like this? You know, if you see something, say something. If there's processes, and I find, you know, this is as you move up in the hierarchy, and I never wanted to become that ADM that said, hey, you know, I was wondering about this, and then all of a sudden, like a team mobilizes and they're working for 12 hours on trying to produce. And I was like, no, I was just thinking. So I do think a lot of times, you know, again, professional humility, find out how, when, you know, if you're a senior executive, when you're asking for something, what's the machine under you doing? And I think a lot of times we don't realize how much work goes into the development of products, the development of artifacts. And so, you know, as executives, take the time to open the hood, sit down with your employees and find out, so how does this actually work? Because a lot of times we don't see that. And I think that's an area that we could do it in. But then you also need to have, on the other side of that, as I said, leadership from every seat. And I know, you know, if there are people from on my team, and many of them have done this, they've said, Paul, it doesn't make sense that we're doing this, and let's change it. Great, that's perfect. If I don't know about it, I'm not going to have the opportunity, and especially dealing with, you know, the fires of the day, people that raise those things to me, we're going to change. And I think you have to have that courage. Leaders have to have the professional humility to accept that, and employees need to have the courage to stand up and say, this is not making sense, and we need to change it.